Clara pressed her back against the hidden mahogany bookshelf door, her hands trembling around a rusted iron crowbar as armed mercenaries smashed through the parlor upstairs. 30 feet below the freezing Gothic mansion lay a subterranean vault housing a $150 million medical prototype, her eccentric uncle's secret cure for the very respiratory illness threatening her 8-year-old son's life. Victor Trent's men believed they were raiding an isolated house to intimidate a desperate, penniless waitress into signing away a worthless 40-acre plot. They had no idea she had already unlocked the vault, holding the ultimate proof that would ruin their corporate empire forever. Clara Hayes was exactly 48 hours away from being homeless. The eviction notice taped to her cramped Chicago apartment door was a glaring neon-pink reminder of her failures. At 32, she was working double shifts at a downtown diner, entirely consumed by the crushing weight of medical debt. Her 8-year-old son, Leo, had severe asthma, and the out-of-pocket costs for his inhalers and hospital visits had entirely drained her meager savings. Clara didn't have time for fairy tales, and she certainly didn't have time for the heavy, cream-colored envelope that arrived in her mailbox on a freezing Tuesday morning. The return address read, Harrison, Gable and Cromwell, Attorneys at Law. Clara assumed it was another collection agency using a disguised letterhead, but inside was a formal summons. Her great-uncle, Arthur Pendleton, had died. Clara barely remembered Arthur. He was the black sheep of her mother's family, an eccentric, paranoid recluse who had cut ties with the rest of the bloodline decades ago. The family rumor was that Arthur was a brilliant but unhinged engineer who had squandered a small fortune on bizarre doomsday preparations before vanishing into the woods of New England. Desperate for even a few $100s of inheritance, Clara scraped together enough money for a babysitter and took the train to the towering glass and steel offices of Harrison, Gable, and Cromwell. She was met by Richard Gable, a senior partner with cold, calculating eyes and a suit that cost more than Clara made in a year. He looked at Clara's worn winter coat with thinly veiled disdain. Mr. Pendleton's estate is complicated, Miss Hayes. Gable began sliding a thick, leather-bound folder across the mahogany desk. He died essentially penniless in terms of liquid assets. His bank accounts were empty. However, he did leave behind a single property, a 3-story Victorian estate situated on 40 acres of dense timberland in Aroostook County, Maine. Clara's heart leaped. 40 acres, a 3-story house, even if it was dilapidated, she could sell it. It could pay off the medical debt. It could buy her and Leo a fresh start. I'll sell it, Clara said immediately. How fast can we put it on the market? Gable offered a tight, patronizing smile. You misunderstand. You do not own the property yet. Mr. Pendleton was deeply distrustful of the modern financial system, and his will contains a highly specific, irrevocable residency clause. To inherit the deed, you must physically occupy the house for 30 consecutive days. You cannot leave the property boundaries. If you fail to meet this condition, the estate defaults to a secondary beneficiary, a corporate entity that recently purchased the surrounding logging rights. Clara stared at him, stunned. 30 days? I have a job. I have a son. I can't just disappear into the woods for a month. Then you forfeit the inheritance. Gable replied smoothly, almost eagerly, and the property transfers to Crestmont Capital. If you choose to forfeit right now, I am authorized by Crestmont to offer you a flat buyout of $10,000 for your trouble. $10,000? It was enough to stop the eviction and breathe for a month or two. It was a lifeline, but Clara saw the way Gable's fingers tapped anxiously against his desk. She saw the slight bead of sweat on his temple. He wanted her to take the buyout. A high-powered Chicago lawyer didn't personally handle the estate of a penniless old man unless there was a massive underlying agenda. Clara thought of Leo's medical bills, of the agonizing double shifts, of a lifetime of being pushed around by people with money and power. She looked Gable dead in the eye. "Draw up the paperwork," Clara said, her voice trembling but resolute. "Leo and I are going to Maine." 3 days later, Clara and Leo were crammed into a rented, heavily used Subaru Outback, driving through a blinding snowstorm near the Canadian border. The GPS had lost signal 2 hours ago. They were navigating by paper maps and Arthur's cryptic, hand-drawn directions. When they finally turned onto Frost Creek Road, the temperature had plummeted to 12 degrees. The trees here grew unnaturally close together, their branches forming a claustrophobic, skeletal canopy over the unplowed dirt road. At the end of it stood the Pendleton estate. Clara killed the engine, and a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the car. The house was a towering, Gothic nightmare wrapped in a thick sheet of ice. The paint was peeling, the shingles were rotting, and the windows were duck and hollow. But what chilled Clara to the bone wasn't the decay. It was the security. Every first-floor window was reinforced with heavy custom-forged iron bars. The front door wasn't just wood. It was a solid slab of steel with 4 separate deadbolts. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a fortress designed to keep something out or keep something in. "Mum," Leo whispered from the back seat, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "I don't like it here." "I know, baby," Clara said, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. "It's just for 30 days. It's just an old, ugly house. We're going to be fine." She had no idea how spectacularly wrong she was. The first week was a brutal battle for simple survival. The estate's electricity had been severed years ago. The only source of heat was a massive cast-iron wood stove in the central parlor. And Clara spent her days chopping firewood in the freezing shed just to keep the indoor temperature above 40 degrees. They lived out of cans of soup heated over the flames, sleeping on an air mattress dragged directly in front of the hearth. But the cold was manageable. It was the house itself that began to unravel Clara's nerves. Arthur Pendleton hadn't just been eccentric. He had been entirely consumed by paranoia. As Clara explored the upper floors, she found the walls lined with heavy lead shielding. The floorboards creaked with unnatural heaviness. Every room had multiple deadbolts on the inside. In Arthur's master bedroom, Clara discovered a chaotic mountain of journals. The entries were manic, written in jagged, frantic handwriting. He ranted endlessly about the Crestmont vultures, corporate espionage, and something he called the Apex Protocol. January 14th, 2018. One entry read, "They flew a drone over the tree line today. I shot it down. They don't know about the sub-level. They think I'm just a crazy old man holding up their zoning permits. If they knew what I successfully synthesized in the dark, they would bring an army. I have sealed the primary door." Clara dismissed it as the tragic ramblings of a man who had lost his mind to isolation. It is until the morning of the 9th day Clara woke up to fetch more firewood and saw them. Footprints in the fresh snow. They weren't animal tracks. They were heavy military-style boot prints. They circled the entire perimeter of the house, stopping for long periods outside the parlor window, the exact window where she and Leo slept. Whoever it was had been watching them in the dead of night. Panic seized her chest. She grabbed her phone, but the screen mockingly displayed no service. They were entirely cut off from the world, 30 miles from the nearest police station. Clara found an old rusted crowbar in the shed and began carrying it with her everywhere. On day 12, the isolation was finally broken, but not by anyone friendly. A sleek black Range Rover crawled up the snowy driveway. Out stepped a tall, immaculately dressed man in a cashmere overcoat. He didn't look like a local. He looked like Wall Street. Clara stepped out onto the porch, gripping the crowbar behind her back. "You're trespassing!" she shouted over the biting wind. The man smiled, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "Miss Hayes, I apologize for the intrusion. My name is Victor Trent. I represent Crestmont Capital. Richard Gable informed us you decided to brave the winter up here." "You have no business here," Clara said, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Actually, I do," Trent said, stepping closer, his eyes darting quickly over the steel-reinforced door. "We own the logging rights to the adjacent 90,000 acres. This little 40-acre plot of yours is right in the middle of our proposed transit route. Your great-uncle was remarkably stubborn about selling. We're hoping you'll be more reasonable." Trent pulled a sleek silver briefcase from his car and popped it open on the hood of the Rover. Inside were neat stacks of crisp $100 bills. $200,000, Trent said softly. "Cash, right now. You sign the quitclaim deed, you pack up your lovely son, and you drive back to Chicago today as a wealthy woman. No more freezing. No more struggling." Clara stared at the money. 200 grand. It was life-changing. It was the answer to every prayer she had whispered in the dark. All she had to do was say yes. She took a step forward, ready to agree. But then she paused. She looked at Trent's expensive Italian leather shoes, currently sinking into the filthy, freezing mud. She looked at his eyes. They weren't relaxed. They were wide, fixed on her with a desperate, predatory intensity. Why would a billion-dollar logging conglomerate send a senior executive into the frozen wilderness to hand-deliver $200,000 in cash to a waitress? If this was just about a transit route, they could easily build around 40 acres. It would cost them nothing. They were terrified of something. They wanted her out now before she found it. "No," Clara said, her voice shocking even herself. Trent's smile instantly vanished. The charismatic mask slipped, revealing something cold and violent underneath. "Ms. Hayes, I strongly advise you to reconsider. Accidents happen in these woods. Heating systems fail. People freeze. Take the money. Get off my property," Clara ordered, pulling the crowbar out from behind her back. "Or I'll see how well that cashmere holds up to solid iron." Trent stared at her for a long, terrifying moment. Then he snapped the briefcase shut. "You're making a fatal mistake. You have no idea what you're sitting on." He climbed back into the Rover and sped away, leaving Clara trembling in the snow. When she went back inside, she didn't sit by the fire. She went straight to Arthur's study. "You have no idea what you're sitting on." Arthur's journals mentioned a sub-level, but Clara had searched the entire house. There was no basement door. There were no exterior cellar storm doors. The house sat on a massive, solid concrete foundation. Clara found a dusty tape measure in a kitchen drawer and began measuring the interior walls, doing frantic math on a scrap of paper. The central hallway was exactly 45 feet long, But when she measured the study on the left and the dining room on the right, their combined length, including the thickness of the plaster walls, was only 36 foot. There was a 9-foot gap, a dead space right in the center of the house. Clara rushed to the back of the study, facing the wall that bordered the hallway. It was covered floor to ceiling by an intricate built-in mahogany bookshelf. She began pulling books off, wildly throwing heavy encyclopedias and dusty medical texts to the floor. When the shelves were completely empty, she pressed her hands against the wood. She pushed. Nothing. She felt around the edges, running her torn fingernails along the trim. Near the bottom corner, she found it a small hidden latch disguised as a decorative brass rosette. Clara pressed it hard. A heavy metallic clack echoed through the silent house. The entire bookshelf shifted forward by an inch. With a grunt of effort, Clara jammed her crowbar into the crack and pulled with all her might. The heavy wooden unit swung outward on hidden steel hinges, groaning in protest. A rush of freezing, stale air hit her face, smelling of ozone and machine oil. Behind the bookshelf wasn't a secret room. It was a concrete stairwell spiraling down into pitch-black darkness. The steps weren't wood. They were heavy industrial grating. Clara grabbed her heavy-duty flashlight. Told Leo to lock himself in the parlor and not make a sound, and began her descent. She walked down 3 flights of stairs, realizing quickly that she was going far deeper than a standard basement. The air grew impossibly cold. Finally, her boots hit a solid concrete floor. She swept the flashlight beam through the darkness. She was standing in a massive subterranean bunker. The walls were lined with complex server racks, ancient supercomputers covered in dust, and strange glass-encased centrifuges. But that wasn't what made Clara drop the crowbar. At the far end of the bunker stood a circular, solid steel vault door. It looked like it belonged on a nuclear submarine, and stamped into the center of the metal in bold red lettering were the words, Project Apex Prototype 01. Beside the vault door was a keypad, and resting on a small table next to it was a single laminated piece of paper with Richard Gable's law firm logo on it, alongside Crestmont Capital's letterhead. It was a signed contract dated just 2 days before Arthur's death. It read, Upon acquisition of the Pendleton patent and physical prototype, Crestmont Capital agrees to pay the sum of $150 million. Clara. Clara stared at the zeros, her breath catching in her throat. Her great-uncle hadn't been crazy. He had invented something so valuable that a corporation was willing to freeze out a single mother, or worse, to steal it. Suddenly, a loud, violent crash echoed from the floor above. Wood splintered. Heavies hit the floorboards. Leo screamed. Victor Trent hadn't driven back to town. He had brought his men. The scream tore through the freezing, silent air of the house, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror that made Clara's blood run entirely cold. It was Leo. Clara didn't think. The primal protective instinct of a mother overridden every logical synapse in her brain. She dropped the heavy-duty flashlight, letting it clatter against the concrete bunker floor, and gripped the rusted iron crowbar with both hands. She took the metal grate stairs 2 at a time, her boots ringing loudly in the narrow, pitch-black shaft. As she reached the top of the hidden stairwell, she pressed her back against the mahogany wood of the secret bookshelf door, listening intensely. Heavy, aggressive footsteps thudded across the oak floorboards of the hallway. There were at least 3 of them. "Check the kitchen," A gruff, unfamiliar voice barked. "Trent wants them contained, not dead. Not yet, anyway." "I saw the kid run toward the front parlor," another voice replied, much closer. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She cracked the secret door just an inch, peering into the gloom of Arthur's study. A massive man in a black tactical jacket was stepping through the shattered doorway of the parlor, sweeping a high-powered tactical beam across the room. Leo is in there, Clara thought, panic threatening to paralyze her. He's hiding behind the wood stove. Clara slipped out from behind the bookshelf, her movements completely silenced by her desperation. She crept up behind the mercenary, just as he illuminated the small, trembling frame of her 8-year-old son, crouched behind the cast-iron stove. "Found the rat." The man chuckled, reaching down to grab Leo's collar. Clara swung the crowbar with every ounce of strength her exhausted, overworked body could muster. The solid iron connected violently with the back of the man's knees. He roared in pain, his legs buckling instantly, sending him crashing onto the hardwood floor. "Leo, run!" Clara screamed, hauling her son up by his arm. They sprinted back toward the study, the sounds of shouting echoing from the kitchen as the other men responded to the commotion. Clara shoved Leo behind the heavy mahogany bookshelf, practically throwing him into the secret stairwell. She pulled the bookshelf shut, just as the study door burst open. "They're behind the wall," a voice yelled. "Bring the sledgehammer." Clara slammed the hidden locking mechanism on the inside of the bookshelf. A thick steel deadbolt slid into place, effectively sealing them inside the shaft. But she knew it wouldn't hold forever. These men were professionals. A wooden bookshelf, no matter how reinforced, would eventually splinter under the assault of a sledgehammer. "Mom, what's happening?" Leo sobbed, clinging to her leg in the suffocating darkness. "Who are they?" "We're going down, baby. Quickly," Clara said, clicking on the spare pen light she kept in her pocket. "It's a game. Uncle Arthur left us a puzzle, and we have to solve it to win." They scrambled down the 3 flights of grated stairs, the terrifying crack of heavy tools hitting wood echoing from above. When they reached the bottom, Clara hurried to the massive nuclear-style vault door labeled Project Apex. She stared at the digital keypad. It was blinking a steady, menacing red. She had no code. Arthur had left no obvious key. Thud. Thud. Crack. The men upstairs were making progress. Dust and wood splinters began to drift down the stairwell. Clara's hands shook wildly as she stared at the keypad. 3 attempts. The small LCD screen read, 3 attempts before a lockout. "Think, Clara, think," she muttered frantically. She thought back to Arthur's manic journals. "I have sealed the primary door. They don't know what I successfully synthesized in the dark." Synthesized. Medical jargon. Arthur was an engineer, but the terminology he used sounded like biology. She looked at the date on the contract from Crestmont Capital. October 12th. She typed in 10:12. Error. The keypad flashed aggressively. 2 attempts remaining. "Mum, they're breaking through," Leo cried, pointing up the shaft where a sliver of light had suddenly appeared. Clara closed her eyes. What else was in the journal? The date he shot down the drone. The day he realized Crestmont was actively hunting him. January 14th, 2018. She typed 011142088. Error. 1 attempt remaining. Tears of pure frustration spilled over Clara's cheeks. She looked down at Leo, who was wheezing, his asthma flaring up from the cold, the dust, and the sheer terror of the moment. She reached into her pocket, pulling out his rescue inhaler and pressing it to his lips. "Breathe, Leo. Deep breaths." As she looked at the inhaler, a memory hit her with the force of a freight train. The first time Arthur had met Leo. Clara had been a teenager holding her newborn son at a rare, awkward family gathering before Arthur vanished for good. Arthur had looked at the sickly, wheezing infant, his paranoid eyes softening for just a fraction of a second. "The lungs are the body's weakest filter," he had muttered cryptically. "I will fix that one day." Clara looked at the vault. Project Apex. Not a weapon. A filter. What was Leo's birthday, the day Arthur made that promise? August 9th, 2017. With trembling, blooded fingers, Clara typed 092017. The keypad beeped. The red light turned solid, brilliant green. A heavy hydraulic hiss echoed through the cavernous bunker. The massive steel locking bars retracted with a deafening clank, and the vault door slowly swung open, revealing a pristine, stark white laboratory bathed in emergency LED lighting. Clara pushed Leo inside and grabbed the manual override wheel on the interior of the door. Just as the bookshelf upstairs shattered completely and heavy boots began clanging down the metal stairs, Clara heaved the vault door shut, spinning the locking wheel until it clicked into place. They were sealed inside. Safe for now. Clara turned around, her breath catching in her throat as she took in the contents of the vault. In the center of the room, resting on a polished steel pedestal, was the Apex prototype. It was roughly the size of a microwave, constructed of clear, heavy-duty polycarbonate and titanium. Beside it sat a thick dossier stamped with the crest of Johns Hopkins Medicine, an independent verification report. Clara opened it, her eyes scanning the highly technical jargon. It was a localized atmospheric hyperoxygenator and synthetic lung system. It was designed to pull in massively polluted toxic or allergen-filled air and output perfectly purified, medically optimized oxygen. But it wasn't just a filter. The machine actively synthesized a safe, breathable atmosphere capable of reversing severe respiratory degradation. Arthur hadn't just built a machine. He had built a cure for asthma, COPD, and industrial respiratory diseases. It was a device that could render billion-dollar pharmaceutical dependency obsolete. No wonder Crestmont Capital wanted it. They weren't a logging company. They were a proxy holding firm for a massive pharmaceutical conglomerate. They wanted to buy the patent, lock the prototype in a dark room, and ensure it never saw the light of day. A cure is a one-time payout. Treatment is a lifetime of profit. And they were willing to kill a mother and her child to keep their bottom line intact. A booming voice echoed through the thick steel of the vault door via an external intercom system. "Ms. Hayes." Victor Trent's voice crackled, devoid of the charming veneer he had worn earlier. "You have nowhere to go. There is no secondary exit. You are trapped in a titanium box 30 feet underground. Open the door." Clara stood in front of the console, her eyes darting around the laboratory. Arthur was deeply paranoid, which meant he would never trap himself without a line to the outside world. She spotted it in the corner. A heavy, antiquated computer terminal hardwired directly into a massive, heavily shielded server rack, a dedicated encrypted satellite uplink. "I know what this is." "Trent!" Clara shouted back at the door, her voice steadying as righteous anger replaced her fear. "I know it's a medical prototype. I know Crestmont wants to bury it to protect their pharmaceutical investments." Trent laughed, a cold metallic sound through the speaker. "You're a waitress from Chicago, Clara. Who is going to believe you? You die down here from carbon monoxide poisoning from a tragic heating failure. The property defaults to us, and we take the machine. It's simple mathematics. I will give you one last chance. $5 wired to an offshore account right now. Open the door, give me the prototype, and you and the boy walk away. It was a lie, and Clara knew it. The second she opened that door, she and Leo were dead. You don't pay witnesses who have seen the literal skeleton in your closet. Clara's fingers flew across the keyboard of Arthur's terminal. The system was ancient, but remarkably fast. She found the digital blueprints, the patent applications, and the signed Crestmont buyout contract that proved their criminal intent. I'm not walking away, Clara said, her eyes locked on the upload progress bar on the screen. And you're not getting the prototype. Then we will cut through the hinges with thermal lances. It will take an hour. Spend it saying goodbye to your son, Trent snarled. You won't have an hour, Clara replied coldly. She hit the execute command. What did you just do? Trent asked, a hint of genuine panic creeping into his voice. My great-uncle was a genius, but he was terrified of the internet. I'm not, Clara stated, stepping closer to the intercom. I just mass emailed the complete unredacted technical blueprints of the Apex protocol, the independent Johns Hopkins verification study, and your $150 million suppression contract. I didn't send it to the police, Trent. I sent it to the investigative desks at Reuters, Bloomberg, and the Washington Post. I also CC'd the Securities and Exchange Commission. Silence hung heavy over the intercom. You're bluffing, Trent whispered. Check your phone, Clara challenged. Outside the vault, Trent pulled his encrypted smartphone from his pocket. It was already vibrating violently. He had 12 missed calls from the Crestmont Board of Directors. A news alert popped up on his screen from Bloomberg terminal. Leaked massive biotech suppression scandal implicates Crestmont Holdings. Trent's face went entirely pale. The secret was out. The blueprints were public domain. The prototype was suddenly worthless to them. And the paper trail of their illegal buyout attempt was in the hands of federal regulators. You ruined us, Trent hissed through the speaker, his voice dripping with venom. You stupid, arrogant, get off my property, Clara interrupted, her voice ringing with absolute authority. Before the FBI traces the IP address of that upload and finds you standing over a kidnapped child. A moment later, Clara heard the frantic, chaotic sounds of heavy boots sprinting up the metal stairs. Vehicles peeled out of the frozen driveway above. The siege was over. For the next 18 days, Clara and Leo lived quietly in the bunker. It was fully stocked with MREs, bottled water, and a geothermal heating system that Crestmont hadn't known about. They read Arthur's books, played board games, and watched the snow fall from the heavy security monitors. Clara completed the 30-day residency clause to the exact minute. When she finally emerged from the frozen estate and drove back into town, the world had exploded. Crestmont Capital was under heavy federal investigation, its stock utterly decimated. Richard Gable had been disbarred and was facing federal racketeering charges, and Clara Hayes was the sole legal owner of the Pendleton estate and the original physical Apex prototype. Instead of selling to a corporation, Clara licensed the manufacturing rights to an open-source medical consortium backed by the Gates Foundation, ensuring the hyperoxygenators would be produced at cost for hospitals worldwide. Her initial licensing fee, a staggering $150 million a year later, Clara sat on the wraparound porch of a beautifully restored sunlit Victorian estate in Maine. The iron bars were gone. The ice had melted into a lush, vibrant green spring. She watched as Leo sprinted across the massive lawn, chasing a golden retriever puppy. He was laughing, running at full speed without a single cough. He didn't carry an inhaler anymore. Clara took a sip of her coffee, the warmth spreading through her chest. She had inherited a frozen nightmare, but she had fought through the dark to secure something infinitely more valuable than money. She had secured their future. Clara risked everything to protect her son, turning a frozen inheritance into a global medical miracle and a massive $150 million fortune. She completely outsmarted the corporate vultures at their own game. If Clara's incredible courage and this jaw-dropping basement secret kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this amazing story with your friends and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling real-life mysteries. See you next time.